Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, who's the co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
Morning, Dr. Paul. We got a little rain today, so hopefully we can get through.
Okay. We don't want to have any competition. But I want to talk today about a speech given yesterday, the Donald Trump speech on foreign policy. And of course, we're very interested in foreign policy, and we remain very interested in trying to figure out Donald Trump's foreign policy. And some days we hear things that we sort of like, and then other days we hear things that just seem to be off the wall. And of course, that seemed to be a liability for him, because those who don't like him for all reasons can hit him pretty hard for not having a consistent philosophy. I'm not sure that Hillary is any more consistent about it, but she's consistently wrong in intervention and wants to do too much. So in a subtle way, I sort of know what to expect from her. It doesn't shock me when I know she gets involved in intrigue in Libya and doing these things that we don't like. But Trump, it's more difficult, to figure out exactly what he's talking about. Now, I didn't get to watch this whole program. I watched a little bit of it. I tried to keep up with it. But in your looking at what he has said and reading what he has said, did you come off with anything that we might say, well, this is great if he would only stick to his guns on some of this?
Well, I think if we could just take one sentence out, carve it into a plaque, and put it and force him to look at it every day, is when he says the era of regime change and nation building is over. It's a failure. I'm not going to do it anymore. If we could just force him to adopt that as his one sentence policy, then the rest would sort of fall into place.
But then in the next step, he might say, well, we need to increase the bombing and increase drones. And I guess if he doesn't want to occupy the countries, what are we doing? But he's also talking about a policy where America will be rewarded. If we're involved with NATO, everybody pays their fair share. We'll do the work, but we get the money. If we have to go in, and we have to do the fighting, we ought to keep the oil, or we go in and get the oil. I mean, he's made these statements that we ought to, when we go into Libya, we ought to go in and get their oil, this sort of thing. That's where the confusion comes. So there's a lot of people who want to endorse and promote Trump because they can't stand Hillary, but at the same time, he doesn't make it very easy for people, because it's really pretty difficult to understand exactly what the consequences will be. For instance, NATO. Do you know what his position is on NATO?
No, and I think one of the things is his populism is full of contradictions, which I think populism tends to be. On the one hand, I think he correctly identifies Americans' reluctance or reticence toward a foreign policy where we are altruistic. We give safety and security for free. And Americans don't like that. But on the other hand, Americans tend to be pretty hostile and militant, and I think he also captures that. So these two are sort of contradictory positions that he holds at the same time.
And brings them together. That's his coalition.
Yeah.
Two sides of the issues, and people hear what they want to hear and dismiss what they don't want to hear. But there was one article here that got my attention because my name was mentioned. I get very sensitive about that. Is it going to be good or bad? But I think they make a point, and I'm going to read a very short paragraph here where they bring my name into it. He says, Trump's chameleon-like prescription for the Middle East is not consistent with any one school of thought. I agree with that, or with itself. Sometimes he resembles a non-interventionist in the vein of Ron Paul, like when he decries nation building, which you mentioned, and regime change in his speech on Monday. At other times, he sounds like Genghis Khan, like when he demanded in the very same speech that American troops conquer oil fields in Iraq by force and claim the profits for America. He previously suggested in 2011 that the U.S. claim Libya's oil as well. So do you think he misused my name in this article, or did they make the point?
Well, I think he knows that there is a coalition that has been behind your views of non-interventionism, and I think he's smart enough to know that he needs to tap into that. He needs to tap into every crevice that he can find. But it's so frustrating when you do have some kernel of non-interventionism, the idea that nation building, especially regime change, because to me that implies that he will once again start taking seriously national sovereignty, not just ours, because we've always been do as we say, not as we do, but starting to respect the sovereignty of other nations, which would make for a more stable world.
You know, there's a lot of talk about the Never Trump movement, the Republicans who've been pushed aside, you know, the Bush clan and others like that, and Mitt Romney. And I keep thinking that, you know, Romney was involved. I think he was involved in this last election, and I was involved in 12. And there was a libertarian presence, and I wasn't bashful about it, and I was actually encouraged by it. But at the same time, you know, when it came to the convention, the official Republican Party did their job. Well, there aren't that many libertarians. You know, we don't need them. We can win this election easily. And so they dismissed the libertarian movement and sort of kicked them out of the party. And, of course, they didn't win the election. But in a way, it's similar right now. There is a populist group that Trump has gotten together, although it's more difficult to define and not based on one basic principle like libertarian is of non-aggression. But once again, the Republicans are doing everything conceivable. They're sacrificing, they're willing, it looks like, to sacrifice even this party control of the presidency just so we, you know, can cling on to some of this neoconservative foreign policy. But it looks to me like the result of both the 4 years ago and this year is, you know, probably the total complete disintegration of the old Republican Party. The old Republican Party may have ended, you know, over the last 10, 15 years, but these last couple, really it's the Republican Party picking and choosing. If you don't go along with what we say on foreign policy, and if you don't go along with our civil libertarian position, if you don't go along with deficits and military budgets, you know, we don't want you in there. I don't know whether there's anything to that theory or not, but it seems to me like the Republicans aren't doing themselves much of a favor.
I think one thing that the Republican elite doesn't understand is really how much they're despised and hated. And what they did to your campaign in 2012 just put fuel under the fire, you know, and it irritated people. So they're basically, they're all the quarterbacks. There's no one else on the team, and the team is despised.
Right. You know, the one thing that Trump gets criticized with is because he's implied that if we have to go to battle, if we're in a NATO, we will, you know, align ourselves with, you know, even bad dictators. And, of course, the holier-than-thou opposition, oh, this is terrible. Yeah, who's been aligning themselves with dictators for 25 years or longer? You know, it's just been going on forever. Then I get to thinking he gets beaten up because he isn't anti-Putin enough. He isn't anti-Russia. And people will say he's un-American for this. Besides, Putin is a tough guy. You know, you can't trust him. You know, and they build up this case, and then they say we shouldn't deal with him. What did we do during World War II? we did business, you know, with Stalin. And are they saying that, oh, this guy's like Stalin? Oh, yeah, well, Stalin was our buddy. He went to war with us, and we shared the loot afterwards. They get half of Europe, and we got the other half. So this whole idea, I think, is so hypocritical on going after Trump because he said he would use it. Of course, I wouldn't be involved in doing those kind of things, but if you're in this business of an interventionist policy and you're trying to work it out, the fact that you say something nice about a country and you work with them, you know, it shouldn't be room for people to jump on them.
And I think what the sort of the neocons who run Republican foreign policy don't quite get is how strategically the scene has shifted so radically. On the one hand, we've got to fight ISIS. ISIS is the sine qua non of our struggle against evil.
Right.
But at the same time, you've got to attack Russia, which, and this is something that we hadn't talked about, but I think is extremely important. Really, literally, as we speak right now, the Russians are taking off heavy bombers from a base in Iran for the first time. They have an agreement with Iran to start fighting ISIS and al-Nusra, which is al-Qaeda, in and around Aleppo in Syria. This is a huge shift. And on the one hand, we hate the Russians for what they're doing. On the other hand, they really are fighting ISIS.
Then we get upset when he has a victory against ISIS, and we pretend that ISIS is the total enemy, and it has given tremendous boost to Trump. ISIS, that was more or less the message yesterday. I am going to be the tough guy on ISIS at the same time. So this goes to, of course, the relationship of ISIS to our policy and our presidents. And Trump challenges Obama and Hillary that they created ISIS. And I think that is a little bit distorted. I think there's a relationship of where ISIS comes from, but it isn't like it was a strategy, because it's been going on a lot longer than Obama being in office.
If Obama is responsible for ISIS, it's only because he followed the Bush doctrine. Without substantive change, he was the natural progression of the Bush doctrine. But something else we were talking about before the show that I've really been thinking a lot about, and I hope to even be able to speak about it at our conference in September. But you'd mentioned that, look at what Trump has to listen to for his advisors, his foreign policy advisors. He has Giuliani and John Bolton, and that I've been thinking about this a lot, that there really are no foreign policy experts, considered foreign policy experts, who are not heavy interventionists.
You mean he has Rudy Giuliani on his team? And he didn't get my permission.
But to be considered an expert in Washington on foreign policy, you have to be in favor of more of it, more intervention, more, So a person who says, stop, don't do it, is never considered an expert.
He doesn't have any, even real good realists who don't like the intervention. He's not even talking to them, the best we can tell. Yeah. He's been challenged also, and he talked a little bit about what people say, that he's careless with civil liberties. Of course, when he talks about torture and arresting people and putting them in military prisons and putting Americans in military prisons, we're talking about some serious things on violation of civil liberties. But he also talked about, this vetting. On the one hand, we're not favoring no borders under the conditions we have today. That means we all have to pay for everybody just marching in. So it makes no sense. So you watch your borders, and there has to be some questions. But what person that would be trying to come in here legally that would be coming from a country that may be considered a terrorist country, and they're coming in and they have evil interests, they want to do us harm. They're going to say, oh yeah, I belong to this ISIS group, and I'm coming over here to bomb you. They're never going to tell you they're never going to tell you the truth. So, and the other thing is if you get to this ideological testing, what if you have people coming over? They come from a friendly country. What if they come from Britain or France or someplace, and they're just sort of tired of what's going on in Europe, and they want to come over here and these look like good people. What's your ideological position on our foreign policy of American greatness and exceptionalism? And what's your position on the Bush doctrine? Do you support the Bush doctrine? Do you support the position of preemptive war, because that's our official position? Would they ask those kinds of questions?
Yeah, the Constitution.
Do they believe in the Constitution?
But it seems like Trump wants to on the one hand, he wants to make it about peace, no nation building, no overturning foreign governments. But he also has to put red meat in there and make it a lot about war. The speech is all about radical Islam. We've got to fight radical Islam. But as you've said many times, he doesn't understand what causes it. I'm sure he's never read Robert Pape about why people get radicalized, why they want to commit suicide terrorism. So he wants to do more of what caused the problem in the hopes that it will solve the problem. And so he's lacking that sort of...
and he simplifies it and just says, Obama created ISIS. But ISIS is sort of a symbol now for anybody who will use violence against us because they're annoyed with our foreign policy. But they don't want to deal with foreign policy. They have to deal with personalities and political party things. But they want to make sure that we talk to these people and violate their civil liberties is what I think they're doing. And then to say, ISIS. What about Hamas? Hamas is, enemies of Israel, enemies of the United States, but we sort of endorsed that. Our CIA was involved, and I think even Israel condoned it because they were going to be against the Palestinian order.
Yeah, it was sort of the Leninist principle,
Yeah.
But the other thing that I was going to bring up, and I thought it was interesting about Trump's speech, is that he mentioned President Obama's 2009 speech in Egypt, redefining our relations with the Muslim world. And he criticized it very strongly for failing to emphasize radical Islam, et cetera, et cetera. I think he's on the right track for criticizing it, but he misses the real point of why it was a bad speech. The 2009 speech was really opening the door for the Arab Spring, which a lot of it was engineered by the U.S. We thought we could go in there and realign these countries and turn them all into places that we'd like them to be, and the result has just been chaos. So his instinct, again, is to not look at the causation, what causes the problem.
And with this, of course, who's doing the recruiting? Oh, it's the internet. So we got to clamp down on the internet,
That's right.
and that's going to solve the problem. But what you're talking about is where the real recruiting comes from. There are violent streaks, I think, in all cultures and all religions, but they're sort of dormant. But if conditions get so bad, they become more favorable to the general public, and I think that is what happens. So when you go in and occupy these countries, and the bombing and the killing, is a recruiting tool. That's really the big recruiting tool. So in one sense, Trump talks about peace. In the next sense, he's talking about, I am going to be the toughest guy in the world. I'm going to increase the military spending, and we're going to have a powerful military, and we will use bombs, and we will use drones, we will use torture, we will use military prisons. Doesn't sound like the peace candidate to me.
Yeah, and I would say if I had to use one word, it's a big disappointment. I'd like to believe the things that we like about what he says is the real Donald Trump. But then, another thing I can't figure out is the whole NATO thing. We talked about it a little. He was great when he said NATO was outdated, it's irrelevant, what's the point? He took a ton of heat from the neocons, from the establishment, from the newspapers. How dare he question our alliances? We've got to defend these countries. He took all the pressure and heat for it. And then a few days later, like in this speech, well, NATO's okay, I changed my mind. They decided to focus on terror. They listened to me, so now it's fine. So it's just dumb to take the heat here and then backtrack on it over here.
But I think when we started this program, you mentioned something about he doesn't have a basic single principle that drives his whole philosophy, and that is easy to use populism for that reason. Because I think, I'm not afraid of the word populism, because I think libertarian type populism, which means that you are appealing to the population, the masses, the middle class, and of course I think that's what libertarian, why it's a great philosophy. But for the most part, it's all over the place. Donald Trump, businessman, he's going to make America great and rich, and everybody's going to have jobs. But then he comes up with this idea that we need a trade war going on, and place on tariffs so that poor people have to pay more money for their goods that they import. So it doesn't add up. But how are we going to clarify this? We have a couple listeners out there wanting to know what should our position be on Donald Trump. The best I can do is what we've talked about. It's very confusing, so I don't trust myself in saying, this is a policy that we can get behind, because I don't understand the policy. Like you made the good point about where is he on NATO?
Well, maybe the phone is ringing in your office right now. He's going to ask for some advice.
Yes, and I would say, hello, Donald. Good to talk to you, but how's the weather up there? Because in my mind, I would say, no matter what I say, you're not going to pay any attention to. And even if you did, it would be changed the next day. That, of course, is oversimplification, but I do want to thank all the viewers for tuning in today. I think this is an important discussion. I think this is a big issue, the foreign policy. We spend a lot of time talking about foreign policy, and we're having this conference in September in Washington. So to me, it's very, very important. I think the coming together of finances and expenditures and debt and special interest politics with the military-industrial complex comes together with our foreign policy. I believe very sincerely that we always have to have an enemy out there, and that gives the motivation and the hatred necessary for people to sacrifice not only their dollars and pay into these outrageous amounts that get into the profiteers in the military-industrial complex, but also the conflicts that can come from it and the injuries and the soldiers that have to be injured, and they become devoted as great patriots if we don't go along with these special interests promoting, this antagonism between whether it's the radical Islamists, so to speak, or the Cold War that we fought for so long. No matter what it is, there always has to be sacrifice. I don't think it's necessary. We should be talking. Trump mentions this, but we should be sincere in talking about national security. And national security can only really be achieved if we mind our own business and not tell other nations how to live, not join all these entangling alliances, not bankrupt our country, not to condone the Federal Reserve System, which finances the welfare state and the warfare state. As long as we have that, we are not going to have a secure nation. And of course, I think the turmoil in our country today is related to the fact that we are bankrupt. Printing money no longer works, running up debts, there's a limit to it, and this foreign policy has a limit to it. And I think this debate that we're seeing in the presidential election indicates that in many ways our foreign policy is bankrupt. And right now I don't see an answer on the horizon, but I do sincerely believe that non-interventionism will provide the ultimate answer that we need, just as sound money would provide a tremendous boost to our very weakening economy. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please return soon.